This is going to be a longer video. I know a lot of my videos are quite a little bit on the lengthy side. The reason I don't do really brief, snappy videos is because I find that the creators who do that tend to have infographics and the sort of technology that allows that. I feel that when I talk about important subjects, it is worth just expanding them out a little bit. And I don't want to make a 3 minute video and then find that there's things I left out. So that's why I have slightly longer videos. So have lunch, do the dishes, feel free to do anything whilst you're watching it. And if you like the content, please do subscribe, share, etc. Okay, just a brief thing that has nothing to do with the subject, but I thought I may as well show you. This is the scene out of my backyard today. So hopefully that was clear. There's snow over much of the UK right now. Little bit unusual in February, but snow makes for beautiful photography. Can cause all sorts of transport problems, but it makes for beautiful photography. I actually had a optician appointment at the Metro Centre yesterday, which is one of Europe's biggest shopping centres, and it was it really was like a ghost environment, like something from a zombie film. So yeah, that's just a sign of the times that we're in, which isn't totally unrelated actually to this video. Freedom. What do we mean by freedom? This is not a straightforward question, I think. There's a few caveats I want to make with this one. Um, First one is I do not believe that absolute freedom exists. And where it does, that is basically anarchy. So, you know, for those of us who believe in the principles of liberty, human rights, and democracy, freedom is sacred. It's a very, very central part of that. Um, we can look at Magna Carta. We can look at the French and American revolutions. We can look at where these values lie, and they're sacrosanct in Western culture. I would argue, though, that actually the basic human desire for freedom is universal. So I don't believe that human rights is a solely Western concept. But that's perhaps for another video. In fact, there's a lot of areas in this that probably require videos of their own, but for the sake of being compact, I'm going to bring them all into this for now. Um, if you take the absolute freedom argument to its extent, let's look at the Rwandan genocide. This might sound like an extreme example, but at that time, Hutu power radio stations, this was radio stations run by Hutu extremists, literally used their airwaves to stir up hatred against the Tutsis and moderate Hutus. They had sort of code words like tall trees, cut the tall trees down because the Tutsis were physically taller. And it played a very large part in the genocide. So those who believe in absolute free speech need to look at something like that. Words have consequences. And that's why I don't believe that there should be a situation where people can say absolutely anything without without scrutiny or without potential consequences if the words really, really do lead to palpable threats to others. And this is why absolute freedom doesn't exist, because if you take the absolute freedom argument, somewhere in that, you're going to have a situation where people can have used their freedom to hurt others. There is no society on earth, even countries that have a reputation for being pretty strong on human rights and liberty, say, for example, the Nordic states, even they have laws, things that you can't do in Norway and Sweden. So that is something that is truly universal. There is no society, no country on earth that has absolute freedom. It's very important to consider that. Um, what other caveats do I want to say? Yeah, again, everything I'm saying in this video probably warrants its own video, but I think they're all connected. Um, there's two. groups in the UK, and I want to just mention them before I forget. They both have Facebook pages and they're both extremely important. They're called Free to Disagree and the Campaign for Common Sense. How influential these groups are, I don't know, but I'm members of both of them on Facebook because I thoroughly agree with the principles. Free to Disagree was set up as a response to the Scottish hate crime legislation that's being proposed by the SNP Justice spokesman, Humza Yousaf. People are concerned about this because they feel it's being used to shackle, for example, criticism of religion. Um, Always be wary of self-declared progressives who use legislation as a guise to ostensibly protect people, but which then starts to get more and more wide sweeping. I think it's very important to really, scrutinize that. Um, and that Scottish hate crime legislation, the irony is it was supposed to be set up as a reform to Scotland's archaic blasphemy laws, which, were never prosecuted. So on the surface, that sounded like a good thing, but when you look at it, it's actually um, more penalising for more areas. So it definitely warrants some question marks. For example, one of the proposed points of this legislation is that potentially people, actually, this might be the England and Wales legislation that's being proposed, is that people who come out with controversial views in their own house. So, say, for example, you have a family having dinner, one of them says something controversial about Black Lives Matter or about whatever. Um, Under the bills being proposed, this could possibly be prosecuted under hate speech. That's deeply alarming. That's deeply alarming. Now, I'm not a lawyer, I'm not a constitutional expert, and I can't claim that I've looked at all of this stuff inside out. But I do think, as a general principle, we need to really look at it. The Equality Act of 2010 in the UK also warrants some discussion. There's things there that make sense, but I think we need to be very careful as to how hate speech is looked at. Um, Everything, by the way, I'm talking about here, I'll try and put links in the video because I think this is very important. Now, I'm going to look at three cases in the UK that warrant a bit of discussion. Looking around the world, it's obvious that there are far more controlling situations than the United Kingdom. So, we're a Western liberal democracy. We like to think that we're pretty free. But I do think there are some limits on this, and we can't take it for granted. I've lived and worked in a communist state, and believe me, there's no comparison. So I get a bit frustrated by people who try to make these moral analogies. It's ridiculous because you just can't compare a situation where you could be punished for criticizing the government versus a situation where you're not. In Britain, you can freely criticize the government. In fact, criticizing the government is one of the easiest things to do in this country, unless you're making threats, that is. Um, but there's other areas in British society that I feel are getting more controlling, particularly around issues to do with diversity and inclusion. Don't get me wrong, those are important issues, and it is important that we are a society that doesn't tolerate such things as bullying and actual discrimination. But there are a lot of question marks over how this is being defined. Um, and I do think it's rife for abuse. So if we look at the international situation, another example is Thailand. Thailand's notorious lèse majesté laws, which I've been quite outspoken about. Again, that's not comparable to the UK. In the UK, the monarchy is generally respected, but it's not, I wouldn't say it's revered. It's respected, but not revered. That's the difference. So if you get a Republican in the UK who, really rubbishes the Queen and their family, chances are some more conservative people, royalists, would take issue with that and they might be offended. But it's not illegal, and nor should it be. I will always, always defend the right of Republicans to speak their mind, although I consider myself a moderate royalist. But I will defend their right to speak their mind and say they don't agree with this hereditary system because that's what it is. Um, so we need to look at how far we have come. We need to look at the very real sacrifices made. There was a time when in Britain you could have went to jail for sedition or questioning royal power. We've come a long way since then, and that's the way it should be. There probably are some things still on statute books if you plot to assassinate the Queen, that's high treason. Um, there's certain things like that, but that's extreme cases rather than simply saying, I don't like her. Um, but even looking at this in context of saying, well, yeah, we're a lot more free, doesn't mean we can take it for granted. Sort of things I'm going to talk about definitely raise questions. The Will Knowland case. Now, I'm not going to go into massive detail with this one because it's well known. Will Knowland is a lecturer at Eton College, was a lecturer, I should say, and he was dismissed a while back because he gave a lecture entitled An Online Lecture, The Patriarchy Paradox. Now, I've spoken a bit about this. Yesterday, I watched an interview with Will Knowland on the Times Radio on their YouTube channel. Check it out, I'll put a link in this. To me, Will came across as very rational, very reasonable, and coherent. He did not sound to me like someone who was, bitter against women and trying to stir up hatred against women. I think his lecture probably offended some feminists because he was focusing very much on evolutionary history. That is to say, that men throughout human history, the vast majority of it, and in most societies, have been the hunter gatherers, the protectors. And this is an evolutionary trait. Sure, there's a few examples in history of, for example, women warriors, but they are the exceptions more than the rule. So Nolan was focusing a lot on that, and I think feminists have kind of homed in on that and said, "Oh, he's saying that men are better than women." He's not saying that, and any reasonable look at that lecture would find that. I think he gave the example of if you have a man and a woman, let's say a couple. Now, let's say it's a snowstorm, like worse than today, and let's say the car isn't starting and they need the car to work, or this is just a rough example. What man is going to allow his wife to go out in the snow and try to rig up a car by herself? Most men would absolutely be the one who does it. If you have a factory situation where heavy objects need lifted, and you have, say, um, this is just a loose example, it's not an absolute factual case, but it's just a scenario. If you have five employees, four of them are women, one of them's a man, in all likelihood, it's going to be the man who does it. I remember I was on a long train journey in China. Two young women got on, and if you've ever been on a train in China, they get pretty crowded. This was a high-speed train. It was a long journey. Two young women had heavy bags, and they needed to put them up to the overhead compartment. I offered to help. No language, just an understanding that I'm making a gesture, and they were grateful. They nodded. They thanked me in Chinese. Um, I wasn't white knighting. I wasn't trying to be virtuous. It was just felt like the decent thing to do. Um, and then I helped them bring them down again. I'm a relatively strong young man, so it's just kind of a reasonable, decent thing to do. I mean, I'm not going to sit there and just watch them struggling. I would do that for anyone. Um, and I would like to think someone would help me out. In fact, they did. There was a time I was rushing to get to the airport. It was pretty stressful. This was again in China. Some young guys helped me. They lifted my bag up and they kind of passed it. It was almost like a scene from Crocodile Dundee. But I was very grateful to their help. Had they not done that, I may not have got off on time and I might ultimately have missed my flight. So that's just a case of basic human decency. But the average man is physically stronger than the average woman, and that is what Will Noland was driving at. Nothing in that lecture could rationally be seen as stirring up hatred against women. Some of it was contentious. The point about he said that more men are raped in prison than women outside. Um, I think that probably does warrant a little bit more discussion or evidence. Um, but he has said that he has 40 references for these things. So I think the lecture could have been a bit better. I think it was a little bit rushed. I think it probably required more time and a bit more expansion on some of the points. But the basic premise of it, how anyone could rationally see that as hateful, is absurd. Now, in the case of Eaton, by the way, he's suing them for unlawful or unfair dismissal based on ideological grounds. And I think that's he's a pretty strong case because Simon Henderson, the headmaster of Eton, has publicly said that he weighs very heavily on being progressive. So I don't really accept these arguments that Eton is making that they were simply taking legal advice. I think this is an ideological decision because Will Knowland made a provocative lecture and apparently one member of staff complained, one, and that person claimed that it could create a hostile environment. Let's put this in context. Will Knowland is a lecturer at a boys' college. He is talking about issues that will impact these young men later in life, about their role in society, about issues like male suicide, the concept of masculinity, etc. All Will Knowland is arguing for is a bit of balance. He's saying if we're going to talk about toxic masculinity, let's at least have some balance and talk about pros and cons of masculinity. That's all he's saying. So the idea that he could be reported to prevent, Simon Henderson's denied this, but apparently he was reported to prevent the anti-terrorist organization, is staggering. I would urge people to watch the lecture. It's still there. It's on YouTube. You might not agree with his views, but the idea that a man should lose his livelihood over this is very alarming. So I 100% support Will Knowland. He's also got support at parliamentary level, even going up to ministers. He very diplomatically didn't disclose which ministers, but he has support. Uh, Needless to say, a lot of the students support him. There are critics, but you know, I think the way this man's been treated is grossly unfair, and there is absolutely no way a feminist lecturer at a girls' school will get the same response, even though some of her views could be offensive to men and to women as well. And this actually taps into a very important thing. And he quoted equality legislation of 2010. If we're going to say that offence alone is a way to censor people, what are the implications of that? It basically means you can't talk about anything because any debate subject, by its very nature, is going to be controversial to someone. That's the whole point about debate. I have always taken the view if people don't like Will Nolan's views, debate the man, even challenge him if they think the views are inaccurate. But I don't blame him for refusing to take it down. That would have amounted to censorship. People have said, oh, it was only a temporary measure. I don't buy that. I think when Eaton asked them to take it down, they wanted it down. That's my gut feeling. Now, there's been other cases that warrant discussion. In Scotland, a man was arrested because he made an offensive tweet about Captain Sir Tom Moore. Now, to be clear here, I've seen some, trolling comments about Sir Tom Moore. For example, there was one from an Irish nationalist, which was pretty disgusting. Um, you can get the idea. Basically, along the lines of the only good British soldier who is a dead one, to put it bluntly. Now, I can understand why people would be offended by slurs against Captain Sir Tom Moore. The acclaim that he got was deserved. This is a man who, in his 99th year, made considerable efforts um, to fundraise for humanitarian reasons. I mean, what he done amounts to 32 million, 33 million, in fact, single biggest record, I think, for crowdfunding in this country. And that has real world effects. It will make differences in people's lives because that money goes to NHS resources. Um, this is a World War II veteran, a man who risked his life to serve his country. Um, so the acclaim that Captain Sir Tom Moore, I believe, gets is well deserved, I think. But I still say the fact that someone could be arrested over an offensive tweet is quite concerning. Um, and the unfortunate thing there is there won't be many people who will be bothered because of the subject. The problem here is in the media reports is very, very little information available as to what exactly the tweet was. Now, if he'd said something really vile, this is a 35-year-old man in Scotland, if he'd said something really vile, for example, directed at Captain Moore's family, then I'd have little sympathy. But if he simply said something insensitive, I think a public backlash would have been sufficient. People saying you're full of it or what a wacko, that's an Americanism, but you get the point. The idea that someone could be arrested over something they said, and this is the key point here. People may not agree with that, they may find it loathsome, but we have to be prepared to defend opinions we don't like. That's the cusp of free speech. We have to be prepared to defend opinions we don't like. And to me, getting arrested over a tweet, unless it is a threat, I would say that's excessive and concerning. It's also concerning that there's so little information about it, you know, because that is technically the tactics of a police state. When citizens can just be arrested for something they've said and there's little information. Another case in Birmingham, a man was questioned by a community support officer, police officer. Now, what had happened was he went into a private car park to take a cigarette in his car, in his own car, because he wanted to get away from the kids, as he put it, for 5 minutes. He said that his family was living in two confined spaces and he just wanted a 5 minute break. I think parents everywhere could empathise with that. This community support officer questioned him and said that he was breaking lockdown restrictions, which technically might be true because the reasons to go out is to get food, exercise, and healthcare, emergency healthcare. But surely mental health's important. Now, a stressed out parent wanting a bit of a break for 5 minutes on their own, is that really something the police should be intervening in? West Midlands police have defended it. Of course, PCSOs have no power of arrest, but that's not the point. And the man understandably got quite frustrated. I'm going to put links to all these stories. Um, we are in extraordinary circumstances here. 113,000 people have died. So I understand that these are not normal times. But clearly, there is a world of difference between people going to an illicit party versus a father assuming that what he said is the full story, just trying to get a break for 5 minutes. I think that's an abuse of power. And I can understand the man's reaction. West Midlands Police say sometimes we've got the balance wrong, but we believe our officer acted correctly in this situation. I disagree. I think that was overreach. I think they should have accepted it when he explained the situation. I think there should be a common sense factor here. I think there should be an empathy factor. I mean, the impact on someone who's living in confined space, maybe young children, you can imagine the mental health side of this thing. And I do fear that this is going to have a big impact on a lot of people, potentially even lead to a rise in suicides. So there's been other examples of police overreach during the pandemic, such as the time that South Yorkshire police officer came up to the guy's house. She kept saying that he was breaking lockdown violations. He wasn't. He was in his own garden. South Yorkshire police ended up making an apology. I think this was in Barnsley. There's been too many situations like that. The public will look at this. They'll say, "Okay, you're taking advantage of this pandemic to abuse your power." And I don't think the public will easily forget that. You know, the police, I generally have a lot of sympathy with them. They're in a very difficult job. Sometimes, especially the Metropolitan Police, do have to deal with very stressful situations, violent protests, rioters, and so on. But Not many members of the public are going to be sympathetic to police overreach because in a democracy, that is not something that people respond kindly to. When someone is in uniform, even if they don't have power of arrest, it's the optics of it. We don't live in a police state. And I think common sense should have applied there. The PCSO should have been a bit more understanding and thought, okay, well, he's explained the situation. He's not with anyone else. He's not in some party. He's not going around a shopping centre without his mask, being reckless. He was smoking in his car because he didn't want to smoke around his children. I think common sense should have applied and a bit of empathy. And I do wonder about the training that some of these PCSEs, PCSOs have. I also wonder about the training of COVID marshals and how they're applying this. But there are so many areas that warrant questions. Tertiary education. When the University of Sheffield actually paid students to monitor their peers' microaggressions. Think about that. That is asking another student, where are you from? Or saying everything or not everything is racist nowadays. That would be termed a microaggression. So even defending yourself is a microaggression. That definitely warrants serious scrutiny and, in my view, condemnation. We need to get to a point where we just apply common sense and where we do value liberty. Regarding the pandemic, I hope there's a situation where enough vaccines are rolled out that we can really look for an exit strategy, not just for the economy, but for mental health. We cannot be in this situation forever because it will breed deep resentment. Now, I have no respect for people who churn out reckless conspiracy theories and, they go to hospitals and say, oh, no one's here. Those idiots really do need rebuked. They do because they're insulting NHS staff, they're insulting people who've lost loved ones, and they're spreading misinformation. So I've no sympathy for them. But the basic question of liberty is not something we could take for granted. Um, so I think I've covered everything there. I'm going to put links in this video. If you like this, please subscribe, share. Ultimately, I'll just part with this thought. We can never ever take freedom and liberty for granted. I believe that there is individual responsibility, but I also think that we need to allow scope for offence. Because what one person interprets as offence, another person will see as simply controversial or provocative. I don't support bullies. So when so-called stand-up comics, take cheap shots at disabled children, I am all for calling them out. I'm not saying censor them, but I think they should be condemned. And I've never accepted the argument that something could just be dressed up as a joke. Being deliberately hurtful and obnoxious is not something I support. And I hate bullies, I always have. So I think this can be applied without saying, oh, people could just be as obnoxious as they want. So much of it comes down to common sense. But broadly speaking, I think we need to have as wide a definition as possible. Freedom to criticize religion must be protected. So if someone says they think that Islam is a violent and intolerant religion, they should have the right to do that. Muslims have the right to be offended. What they don't have the right to do is then issue threats. I was disappointed that this government wasn't more outspoken in defending some of the things that were going on in France, such as the young woman who has had death threats because she's perceived to have offended Islam. You might think that's another country, but they're a neighbouring country. I think we should have sent out a message of support saying we support France's liberty. We have to have the right to criticise religion and even dislike religion. Where I would draw the line is, saying, "Oh, I hate all Muslims" or "I hate all Christians," something like that. But there has to be flexibility to say that you dislike something or you disagree with something. So those two groups, freedom to disagree and the campaign for common sense, check them out on Facebook. I'm not sure if I could put links in here. If I can, I will. And let me know your thoughts. I know this has been a longer video, but I feel the issues are very important, and I hope we get some feedback. And ultimately, it comes down to people basically questioning things, and if need be, starting petitions and having a bit of pushback. Because when legislation is made, it's very hard to overturn it. That's the danger. And when we get such issues as, I'll just quickly include this, something like trans issues. If someone says, I believe biology matters, you know, the trans lobby is pushing for something like that to be deemed a hate crime. That is absurd and it needs to be questioned. If you say, if you bully a trans person, if you say they shouldn't have equal rights, that's different. But simply saying biology matters, and I do not believe a trans woman has the same experience as a biological woman. You know, we're now in a situation where simply saying that, which is what the vast majority of people believe, can get land you in hot water. Very, very concerning.